Welcome back to our 7th episode about how to build a Java serializer to JSON using Java Reflection. In this episode, I'm implementing the annotations to configure the attributes and which classes can be serialized or not. So I removed our previous class that we were using to configure the properties and the classes. Now we just target the properties. The advantage of targeting the properties using annotations is that we can, for each one, specify a different format, different configurations. And when we're using a global class of configuration, usually we apply to all fields. We can, for instance, if we decide that fields with null value shouldn't be serialized, it will be applied to all of them. Of course, you can always say, okay, we can create a map and specify for each one. Yeah, it will be a very complicated configuration. In the old days, maybe 15 years ago, probably it will be the approach, but today, since we have annotations, we can easily specify which configurations are best for each field. So for that, I created two annotations in Java. It's quite simple to create annotations. One, it is called my JSON Serializer. It should be applied on classes that we want to serialize. Classes that doesn't have this annotation shouldn't be serialized. And for each property inside the class, meaning the fields, we have a different annotation that I'm calling my JSON property, and we can specify a different name when we are serializing. For instance, rather than password, we can call it secret. Maybe we want to ignore the field, for instance, password, or we want to ignore for a specific property when it is null, so we don't want to serialize it. And when we have a date or a double, we can specify a format. Maybe we want year, month, day, maybe we want the time, and so on. Okay, so these two classes allow us to choose which classes we want to serialize, and for each particular field, what should be the configuration. Of course, this can be enriched with other properties, but the idea is to show how to develop the serializer, not to create one to sell it on the internet or insert it in a specific framework. There are great frameworks for serialization like JSON.org, Jackson, and so on. Okay, so these are two annotations that we created, and now we had to change, of course, the code to adapt to this new reality, meaning that the code now should use the annotations and not the previous class that had global configuration. So I just removed it. The other class you can check on the previous episode if you want to know more details about it. When we remove it, it will be simpler to change the code. Sometimes people, they have problems to remove the code. Don't just remove it if you don't need it and create from zero your new code if it's necessary, because it will be clear. You already have the know-how from the previous developments, so you know how to explore and navigate through your code. Okay, so we go to our serializer. It's the same class as the previous episode. It receives an object. It checks for different types of the object. If we are just serializing a simple data type like a double or a date, it will be serialized by this serialization helper that I'll show in a moment. The same for an enumerator, the same for an array, the same for if it's a collection, if it's a list or a map. If it's not any of these types of object, probably it will be a class that we want to serialize field by field. And in that case, the first thing that we should do, since we now have the annotation, is to check if the myJSON serializer, the annotation that we created to mark the class that can be serialized, exists. If it doesn't exist, just return null. Say, okay, we can throw an exception if it was a professional development, but I'm avoiding to throw exceptions and break the code. So if it displays null, it means that it will not be serialized. Maybe this class was a class that was belonging to a field. And in that case, okay, the field is there, but it will not be serialized, so null is a good value for that. But of course, if the annotation exists, we just start to serialize field by field. So again, if you check the previous episodes, all this code is explained in detail, but we are checking if the field should be ignored. Again, with the serialization helper, I will show you how are we doing this with our notation. The same if the field should be ignored because it's null, meaning if the value of the field is null and is marked for ignore, it should be ignored. And again, checking the data type of the field, very similar to the code here. Okay, and it's the same if it's native, if it's an array, if it's a collection, if it's a list, if it's a map, or if it's an accepted class, meaning an accepted class is a class that should have our new annotation, my JSON property. So let's check our serialization helper, where all the serialization really happens, okay? And we can check the methods. The serialization local dates, it's the same as our previous episode. There is no annotation here because one of the parameters, it's the format, meaning that when we call this class, we are already passing a specific format for that. And the same for serialization number. So when you are serializing a number and you are receiving a format, again, there is no annotation here. Okay, so where are annotations being applied? Okay, the first is serialize field name. And in that case, we receive a field, we receive the JSON where we are putting the JSON that is being serialized. And now I'm checking if the field is annotated. If it's annotated, and we can see with a property, and if we go to the property, we can see that we have a name. If maybe we want to apply the name on the field, okay, and in that case, we will be using the name that's in the annotation and not the name of the field. This only happens if the field has the annotation. If the annotation is not present, the name will be the name of the property in our class. Okay, now this is a method just to get the format in case it's a date. So if the annotation doesn't exist, meaning that you have a field, but there is no annotation there, meaning that the format doesn't have a value. In that case, we are saying, okay, so this should be the default. This method, it's not complete, it's not very accurate, because probably there is the annotation, but the format, if we go here, okay, by default it's empty. Maybe we want to check if it's empty, meaning that no one has written any specific format. It's and we are returning here the format, and maybe we want to check if the format is empty or not. If it's empty, it should return this string also, or we should return the format that it's there. So we can even write it if you want. Why not? If here the annotation exists, but if the annotation format it's empty, okay, return this. Okay, otherwise return what's there. Okay, the same applies here for the decimal. This is to return the given annotation to get the format for the date. This is the format for a decimal, and it's the same logic here. If annotation format it's empty, again, just return this format, otherwise return the format that is written there. So in this case, we are the code now it's more robust, more reliable, and it should work better. No strange things happen behind the scenes. And now when we are serializing the nativish, and when you can check here, it's inside the class in our loop for the fields, but we can check from here. When we are serializing and we check if the object is nativish, so serialize it. And we pass the object and an annotation, but it can be null, this annotation. Okay. So what we are doing here, so we receive here the annotation, and again, when serializing a double or a float, we are calling this get decimal format from annotation with the annotation here, and this is the method that we saw a few seconds ago, like this one. Okay, the decimal, and the same for the date here. Okay, this one. So when we are serializing the data types, if it's an integer, it should serialize as is, the same for string, but the value of the date or from a decimal, it can change the format if it's configured in our annotation that we are receiving on parameter here. Okay, if we return here, other things where the annotation is useful or is being used. Nativish, it's the one that we saw now. And now we have, okay, this one is accepted class. Okay, let's use this one. And the only thing that it does is just to check if the my JSON serializer is present on the field. Okay, if it's present there, so it can be serialized. Otherwise, it won't be serialized. Okay, and then again, let's see other. Okay, let's return to our property. So we have here if it's ignore or ignore null in annotation. So here on our field by field, so to check if it's ignored field or ignore null field, on the ignore field again we receive the field and we check if the my JSON annotation is present, and if it's present and the ignore is set to true by default, as we saw previously, it was false. You can see here. Okay, ignore null. Okay, so again here, this is the line that checks if annotation is present, and if it's present, that's why you have an AND. As you know, it's a short circuit. If it's false, it will never get the second part. If it's true, you will check the second part. It's okay. The JSON property has an ignore and it's true. Okay, so it should be ignored. Otherwise, it will not be ignored. And the same for the null field, but in this case, it will be ignore null. Okay, so here for each field, we are always checking if we should ignore the field or if we should ignore the field when the value is null, and of course the value is really null on our object. And it was quite simple. It's more clean, the code now. It's cleaner than the previous version, because in our previous version we have a parameter here and we are always checking this object, and it was necessary somehow it should have some kind of static objects to share between the class. It was a little bit more complicated. Now, since the annotation is on the field, we just only need the field between when we are calling methods in other classes, and the annotation goes with it, or we just take the annotation and pass as a parameter, so the next method or the method being called can use that annotation or not. Okay, so let's execute this and check the result. Just run. And then we explore the result to see if it's working. So the first name is username, it's here. Okay, the password, you can see that it's not here. And why it's not here? Because our password has this ignore true, and we saw a few moments ago, since the ignore is true, it will just be ignored and there will be no serialization. Okay, now we have, let's again return to our user. Now we have the email, and the email it's here. Okay, now the active, it's a boolean, we have true. And now we have the user type, user info here. And let's see on the here user info, I changed the name to additional information rather than user info, and this is why we are seeing this as the name of the field. And for the string of permissions, I changed the name to authorization, so you can see that here it's the authorization that is being used on the serialization process. This is the departments, so you can see here the departments, and let's see something. I'm sure I have other information here. Okay, this is the format of the date as expected. Okay, this is the format for the salary here. It's working also. And I'm trying to find, I think I put something when it's null or not. Let's go to the main. So we have address. Okay, address, it's not here on the properties, because here on the address, okay, I have written ignore null equals true. That's why it's not here. So to make sure that you believe in my code, I'll just change to false and let's play it again. Run. And we expect to see here the address now with a null value. So these are usually the common configurations in a serializer. There are more than that, maybe sometimes Unicodes and other more deep configurations that are used to adapt to external systems. But in this case, we are just developing a very simple serializer to understand how Java reflection works, what are the challenges for this. And as I said before, one of the main things that we can learn from this, it's not how to build really a serializer, but how to understand the challenges that we have when we are developing one. So it can be really useful when we are troubleshooting connections to systems like Kafka, message queues, APIs. All of them, they serialize objects and they deserialize objects. So if you understand how to develop a serializer, you will understand how these systems work behind the scenes.